In a spotless mansion, a girl lives in isolation, silenced behind social smiles. What seemed like perfection hides cold abuse and a stolen childhood. But a thread of courage breaks the silence and sparks a transformation that reaches the whole country. The Aldridge mansion gleamed like a jewel in the heart of Belgravia, London. Its impeccable gardens showcased imported roses and marble fountains that hummed day and night. Through the enormous windows, crystal chandeliers could be seen reflecting the London sunlight, transforming each room into a spectacle of brilliance and ostentation. For anyone passing by Belgrave Square, that property represented the pinnacle of success, a monument to power and wealth that few in England could achieve. But not all that glitters is gold, and behind those ornate gates lived Sophia, a 7-year-old girl whose brown eyes seemed to carry a weight no child should know. While the rest of the house exuded luxury and perfection, Sophia's room was at the end of a little-used corridor, far from visitors and curious glances. It was a small space, with a single window that overlooked an ivy-covered wall, preventing light from fully entering. The furniture was old, donated from some renovated maid's room, and contrasted brutally with the rest of the mansion's decor. Robert Aldridge, her father, was a powerful businessman in the construction industry. His ventures spread throughout London and beyond, residential and commercial towers that proudly bore his name. He was a man who lived between endless meetings, multi-million-pound contracts and business trips that kept him absent more often than present. When he was home, his mind still wandered through numbers and projects, unable to completely disconnect from the empire he had built with his own hands. 3 years ago, Robert met Valerie Thompson at a charity gala event. She was everything one would expect from a lady of London's high society, elegant, articulate, with a beauty that effortlessly drew attention. A diplomat's widow, Valerie moved with ease through the city's most exclusive circles, chairing charities and regularly appearing in social columns. When they started dating, Robert thought he had found not only a partner, but also a mother for Sophia, who had lost her own mother as a baby. The wedding was celebrated as the social event of the year. The ceremony took place at St. Paul's Cathedral, followed by a reception at the Ritz, London, that brought together politicians, businessmen, and celebrities. Sophia, then 4 years old, served as a flower girl, dressed in a white lace gown that cost more than many families earned in a year. In the photos, she smiled shyly beside her stepmother, who posed with a protective hand on her shoulder. No one could imagine that this gesture, captured by dozens of photographers, was just another performance for the cameras. In the first months after the wedding, Valerie maintained appearances with masterful skill. In front of Robert, she treated Sophia with studied kindness, buying her expensive gifts and taking her to social events where she could display the girl as a trophy of her new position as family matriarch. But when Robert traveled, when the doors closed and the staff were dismissed, the mask fell. Valerie saw in Sophia not a stepdaughter to be loved, but an obstacle between her and the Aldridge fortune. The girl quickly learned to read the signs. When she heard her father's car leaving in the morning for another day of work, her heart tightened. She knew she would have to face Valerie alone, without the protection of her father's presence. Her stepmother would start with seemingly innocent comments about how clumsy, ugly, or stupid Sophia was. Words that penetrated deep into the child's soul, creating invisible wounds that no doctor could heal. Over time, the cruelties became more elaborate. Valerie began to isolate Sophia from the rest of the house. Meals, once taken as a family in the sumptuous dining room, were now served in the girls' room. But they were not the same meals the adults ate. While Valerie savored dishes prepared by a private chef, Sophia received minimal portions of cold food, sometimes leftovers from the previous day that were no longer fit for anything else. The justification was always the same. Sophia needed to learn not to be spoiled. She needed to understand the value of things. The girl visibly lost weight, but Valerie had ready excuses for Robert. She said her stepdaughter was very picky with food, that she refused the most nutritious dishes out of stubbornness. Robert, absorbed in his business and blindly trusting his wife, accepted the explanations without question. After all, Valerie was the president of an institution that fed needy children. How could she neglect a child under her own roof? Punishments also became part of the routine. For any reason, real or invented, Valerie would lock Sophia in her room for hours on end. The girl spent her days looking out the narrow window, watching the seagulls fly free over the Belgravia Sea, wishing she had that same freedom. Her only solace was a battered teddy bear, a gift from the biological mother she had never known. At night, she hugged the toy and whispered imaginary conversations, asking the mother, who was somewhere among the stars, why she had to live that way. Valerie forbade Sophia from calling Robert Dad in front of her. She said the girl didn't deserve that privilege, that she was an intruder in the life Valerie had built. When Sophia, out of habit or despair, forgot and uttered the word, she was severely punished. She would go without dinner, without light in her room, without the few moments of television she was still allowed. The girl learned to silence her own voice, to become a shadow in her own home. The Aldridge mansion continued to receive distinguished visitors. Politicians came for dinners, artists for themed parties, businessmen for Sunday brunches. Valerie shone as the perfect hostess, always in a designer dress, always with the right word on the tip of her tongue. Sophia was occasionally brought to these gatherings, clean and tidy, instructed to smile and thank guests for their empty pleasantries. No one noticed the tremor in her hands, the fear in her eyes, the way she involuntarily flinched when Valerie approached. At the private Belgravia school where she studied, Sophia was a quiet, almost invisible student. The teachers noticed that the girl rarely participated in activities, that her school supplies were always the same, never renewed despite the family's obvious wealth. During breaks, she sat alone under a tree drawing sad figures in her notebook. The other children avoided her, not out of malice, but because Sophia emanated a sadness that instinctively pushed them away. Once, a teacher named Marianne noticed that Sophia had not eaten her snack. When asked why, the girl simply replied that she wasn't hungry. But Marianne saw the way Sophia's eyes fixed on the cheese sandwich another child was eating. She saw the saliva the girl discreetly swallowed. Concerned, the teacher tried to speak with Robert but was met by Valerie, who explained with her usual charm that Sophia was on a doctor-supervised nutritional regimen due to digestive problems. The lie was accepted because it came from a respectable woman enveloped in social credibility. The mansion's staff saw things but kept silent. They had families to support, jobs they couldn't lose. Valerie was careful to keep most of them away during her cruel moments, and the few who witnessed anything were quickly dismissed under fabricated allegations of theft or incompetence. A maid named Constance once tried to question why Sophia ate so little, and was fired the same day without references, her reputation stained by false accusations that Valerie spread among the other wealthy families in the neighborhood. Robert remained oblivious to everything. When he was home on rare weekends, he saw a dedicated wife and a daughter who, though quiet, seemed well cared for. Valerie made sure to temporarily improve Sophia's treatment when her husband was present, giving her normal portions of food, allowing her to watch television in the living room, even demonstrating a superficial affection that completely deceived her father. Robert even commented to friends how lucky he was to have found a woman who loved his daughter as if she were her own. At night, when the mansion finally fell silent and the lights went out, Sophia lay in her small bed and listened to the sounds of the city through the open window. The distant roar of the sea, the cars on the avenue, the laughter of people in nearby restaurants. Everything seemed to belong to a different world, a world she wasn't allowed to enter. She hugged her teddy bear tightly to her chest and made a silent wish to the stars that someone somewhere could see her. That someone could see beyond the gilded walls of the prison where she lived. That someone could save her before she completely forgot who she was. The change began almost imperceptibly, like a thin crack in a marble wall that slowly expands until it threatens the entire structure. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the London sky dawned cloudy, and the air carried that characteristic humidity that precedes summer rains. At the family court headquarters, located in central London, social worker Helen Taylor opened her daily correspondence with the routine of someone who had seen it all in 15 years of her profession. Among the usual envelopes, bureaucratic reports and official communications, there was an anonymous letter. The paper was simple, the handwriting shaky, as if the writer was afraid of being discovered. Helen adjusted her glasses and began to read. The words described a girl living in conditions of severe neglect in a Belgravia mansion. They spoke of a child who spent days locked in a room, who ate less than she should, who was treated with coldness and cruelty by her stepmother, while her father, absent and deceived, noticed nothing. Normally, Helen might dismiss it as exaggeration or misunderstanding. After all, anonymous complaints were common and often came from resentful neighbors or former employees with personal motives. But there was something in that letter that touched her professional intuition. The description was too specific, too detailed. Whoever had written it knew the house's schedules, knew when the father traveled, had witnessed things that couldn't be easily invented. Helen took the case to her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Foster, a middle-aged man who had dedicated his entire life to protecting vulnerable children. He read the letter carefully, frowning at each paragraph. When he finished, he looked at Helen with that expression she knew well, the one that meant they would investigate, regardless of how powerful the family involved was. The Aldridge mansion was easily identified. The address in the letter was correct, and a quick search revealed everything about Robert Aldridge and his wife Valerie. Photos on social media showed a perfect couple, always smiling at charity events, always impeccable. Valerie constantly appeared in society magazine pages, praised for her philanthropic work. Robert was described as one of London's most successful businessmen. All very beautiful, very tidy. Excessively perfect, Helen thought. 2 days later, Helen arrived at the mansion unannounced. It was standard procedure in cases of possible neglect to prevent families from staging scenes. She rang the doorbell and waited, observing the meticulously maintained gardens, the marble statues, the grandeur that exuded from every detail of the property. The door was opened by a uniformed maid, who led her to the living room where Valerie awaited her. The living room was a spectacle of good taste and wealth. Italian sofas, paintings by renowned artists on the walls, a privileged view of the sea through floor-to-ceiling windows. Valerie entered a few minutes later, wearing a beige linen outfit that perfectly matched the decor. Her smile was warm, her posture impeccable. She offered imported coffee, French biscuits, as if receiving social workers was part of her daily routine. Helen observed everything with trained eyes. Valerie spoke fluently about her routine with Sophia, describing a harmonious relationship between stepmother and stepdaughter. She talked about the piano lessons she had arranged, about the expensive clothes she bought for the girl, about how she tried to compensate for the absence of her biological mother. Every word was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. Helen pretended to believe, while mentally cataloguing inconsistencies and exaggerations. When she asked to see Sophia, Valerie hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was an almost imperceptible lapse, but Helen caught it. The stepmother then smiled again and explained that the girl was in her room studying, but would be happy to bring her. She disappeared for a few minutes, enough time for Helen to notice that the house, despite all its beauty, had something artificial about it, like a theatre set where everything was positioned to impress, but nothing seemed truly lived. Sophia appeared a few minutes later, holding Valerie's hand. Helen felt a tightening in her chest seeing the girl. She was clean, tidy, wearing a new dress that still had the tag discreetly folded in the collar. But her eyes were what Helen would never forget. They were empty eyes, without the sparkle that 7-year-old children should have. There was fear there and resignation, and a sadness too deep for someone so young. The social worker tried to talk to Sophia, but the girl responded only with monosyllables, always looking at Valerie before speaking, as if asking for silent permission. Helen proposed speaking with Sophia alone, but Valerie elegantly protested, saying that her stepdaughter was very shy with strangers and would be more comfortable with her present. Legally, Helen could not insist at that moment without a court order, so she had to accept the condition. The questions were careful. Helen asked about school, about friends, about what Sophia liked to do. The answers came out robotic, clearly rehearsed. Yes, she liked school. Yes, she had friends. Yes, her stepmother was very good to her. But when Helen asked what she had eaten for breakfast, Sophia hesitated. Her eyes quickly moved to Valerie, who answered for her stepdaughter, saying she had a full breakfast with fruit and whole-grain toast. Helen had no concrete proof, but her intuition screamed that something was profoundly wrong in that house. Before leaving, she asked to use the bathroom, an old strategy to observe more of the residents. On the way, she passed a secondary corridor and glimpsed a door different from the others. It was locked, which seemed strange to her in a house where all other doors remained open. She memorized the location and continued on her way. Back at the office, Helen drafted a preliminary report. She described her observations, Valerie's reactions, Sophia's behavior. She recommended closer monitoring, but without solid evidence of neglect or abuse, she knew it would be difficult to get authorization for a more invasive investigation. Wealthy families had powerful lawyers, and a misstep could result in lawsuits and loss of credibility. Meanwhile, at school, Marianne continued to worry about Sophia. The girl was increasingly isolated, increasingly thin. Marianne decided to document her observations. She began to note the days Sophia didn't bring lunch, the times the girl seemed excessively tired, the small bruises that occasionally appeared on her arms. These were marks that could be from normal childhood falls, but the frequency and pattern suggested something different. One day during recess, Marianne sat beside Sophia under the tree where the girl always isolated herself. She didn't ask direct questions. She just started talking about simple things, about the clouds in the sky, about the birds in the branches. Gradually, Sophia began to relax. Then, almost without realizing it, she started drawing in the notebook she always carried. The drawings showed a large house, a woman with a smile that looked like a joyless straight line, and a small girl in a dark room. Marianne felt a chill. She gently asked about the drawings, but Sophia immediately closed the notebook, fear instantly returning to her eyes. She asked to go to the bathroom and ran off, leaving the teacher with more questions than answers. That night, Marianne called Helen Taylor, whose visit to the Aldridge home was already known among professionals in the field. The two women talked at length, comparing observations, together building an increasingly disturbing picture. At the Belgravia mansion, Valerie knew she needed to be more careful. The social worker's visit had made her nervous, although she didn't show it externally. She temporarily increased Sophia's food portions, allowed her more time out of her room, even bought new toys that she strategically scattered around the house. But with each forced kindness, her eyes promised the girl that it was temporary, that there would be consequences when the attention dissipated. Robert returned from his trip that weekend. Valerie greeted him with her usual charm, telling him about the social worker's visit as if it were an amusing anecdote. She said that some envious neighbor had probably made a false complaint, but that everything had been clarified. Robert laughed, kissed his wife, and didn't even think to verify the story. After all, Valerie was perfect. His house was perfect. His life was perfect, or so he believed. But somewhere between the cracks of that manufactured perfection, the truth began to emerge. Helen would not give up easily. Marianne would continue documenting. And Sophia, even in her forced silence, carried in her eyes a story that would eventually need to be told. The facade was beginning to crumble, and it would only be a matter of time until everything came to light. In the quiet of the London night, while the city pulsed with life outside, within the Aldridge mansion a silent storm was approaching, still invisible, but as inevitable as the tide advancing over the Belgravia sand. The investigation gained momentum when an unexpected witness emerged. Her name was Constance Santos, the maid Valerie had fired months earlier under false accusations. She now lived in a community on the outskirts of London, working as a day labourer to survive. But the guilt for what she had witnessed and kept silent about in the Aldridge mansion consumed her daily. When she learned through a friend who worked at Sophia's school that an investigation was underway, Constance found the courage to speak. Helen received Constance in her office on a rainy afternoon. The woman entered nervously, wringing her hands, looking over her shoulder, as if fearing she was being followed. She sat in the offered chair and began to speak, the words coming out slowly at first, then in an uncontrollable flow of relief at finally being able to tell the truth. Constance described the months she worked at the mansion, how Valerie treated Sophia when Robert was not present, the scarce meals, the girl's isolation, the disproportionate punishments for minor, childish mistakes. The former maid told of the day she questioned why Sophia ate so little and was immediately accused of stealing Valerie's jewelry. Her stepmother spread the rumor among other wealthy Belgravia families, destroying Constance's reputation and making it impossible for her to find decent work in the area. But what weighed most on her conscience was the memory of Sophia's eyes, that deep sadness she saw every day and about which she had forced herself to remain silent for fear of losing her job. Helen recorded everything with Constance's permission. The testimony was powerful, but it would not be enough on its own. They needed more evidence, more witnesses, a pattern that could not be denied or disqualified by skilled lawyers. The social worker thanked Constance for her courage and promised that the testimony would be used to protect Sophia, not to expose the witness herself to retaliation. With the testimony in hand, Helen obtained court authorization for a more in-depth investigation. The family court judge, Dr. Albert Mason, was known for taking child neglect cases very seriously, regardless of the social position of the families involved. He issued an order allowing unannounced visits to the Aldridge residence and separate interviews with Sophia, away from Valerie's influence. Meanwhile, parallel events began to converge. The Aldridge mansion's neighbor, a lady named Beatrice Miller, lived in an adjacent penthouse with a partial view of the property's gardens. Beatrice was retired, spending her days reading on her balcony, and over the months had begun to notice strange things. She occasionally saw Sophia in her room window, always alone, always with that melancholic expression. In the quiet afternoons, she heard Valerie's voice echoing through the gardens, always too firm, too authoritative to be speaking to a 7-year-old child. One day, Beatrice heard something that made her stand up immediately from her chair. It was Sophia's voice, crying, pleading. The words weren't clear, but the tone of despair was unmistakable. Beatrice took out her cell phone and, without knowing exactly what to do, began to record. She captured fragments of conversations, muffled pleas, Valerie's voice responding with calculated coldness. When the scene ended, Beatrice stood still, trembling, with the recording on her phone, and her conscience screaming that she needed to do something. It was Beatrice's husband, James, who suggested they contact the competent authorities. James was a retired lawyer and knew exactly who to turn to. The next day, the couple was in Helen's office, handing over the recordings. The content was disturbing. Although the audio quality wasn't perfect due to the distance, it was clearly possible to hear Sophia asking not to be locked in her room, asking for food, and Valerie's voice denying with a cruelty that chilled the blood. Helen listened to the recordings with Dr. Marcus beside her. When the audio ended, the two professionals exchanged serious glances. This was exactly what they needed. It wasn't just the testimony of a possibly resentful ex-maid, but concrete evidence of emotional and psychological neglect. Combined with Marianne's observations and Helen's own initial report, they formed a solid case. The next step was carefully organized. Helen coordinated with the school for an interview with Sophia during school hours, an environment where the girl could be away from Valerie's influence. The school principal, Dr. Patricia Smith, provided a comfortable and private room. Helen arrived accompanied by a child psychologist, Dr. Julia Reynolds, a specialist in trauma and emotional neglect. Sophia was led to the room by Marianne, who held her hand tenderly and told her that everything was fine, that these people just wanted to talk. The girl entered hesitantly, her large, frightened eyes fixed on the two unfamiliar women. Dr. Julia had a warm presence, a soft voice that immediately made Sophia relax minimally. They started slowly, talking about neutral things, about the drawings Sophia made, about her favorite colors. Gradually, with infinite patience, Dr. Julia gained the girl's trust. Sophia began to speak, first in whispers, then with a little more firmness. She talked about the dark room where she spent so much time, about how she was hungry, but couldn't eat when she wanted, about how her stepmother said she didn't deserve good things because she was a bad child. The words came out broken, mixed with tears that Sophia tried to hold back, as if crying was also a transgression that would be punished. Helen and Julia documented everything. The psychologist, experienced in cases of child trauma, immediately recognized the signs of severe emotional neglect. Sophia presented classic symptoms: low self-esteem, constant fear of displeasing, inability to express basic needs without guilt. When asked about her father, Sophia said she loved him, but that he was never home and never knew about the things that happened when he traveled. She didn't blame Robert, but it was clear she felt abandoned by him. The interview lasted almost 2 hours. When it ended, Sophia was exhausted, but there was also something different in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, someone had truly listened to her story. Someone had believed her without judging, without doubting. Dr. Julia hugged the girl gently and promised that they would help her, that no one deserved to live in fear in their own home. Meanwhile, Helen met with Dr. Marcus and Judge Dr. Albert Mason. They presented all the collected evidence, Constance's testimony, Beatrice's recordings, the school reports, Sophia's interview. The picture was undeniable. Sophia was living in an environment of emotional and psychological neglect, her mental and physical health at risk. The judge, visibly disturbed by the evidence, authorized a more direct intervention. An order was issued for a new visit to the Aldridge mansion, this time with the presence of a court psychologist and a representative from the Crown Prosecution Service. Valerie could no longer control the narrative. Robert needed to be confronted with the truth about what was happening in his own home. The law protected Sophia now, and no amount of money or social influence could change that. At school, Marianne spoke at length with Sophia after the interview with the authorities. She told the girl that she had done the right thing by telling the truth, that she was brave, that she deserved to be happy. Sophia asked if she would get into trouble, if her stepmother would be angry. Marianne held her small hands and explained that stronger people would now protect her, that changes were coming, that the storm might seem scary, but that after it would come the sun. Valerie, at that moment, still didn't know the extent of the investigation. She continued her routine of appearances, chairing charity meetings, appearing at social events, maintaining the impeccable image of a benevolent matriarch. But the gears of justice were already in motion, and there was no stopping them. The castle of lies she had built was about to collapse, and when it did, everything would come to light in a way that no veneer of respectability could cover up. Sophia, that night, lay in her room clutching the battered teddy bear, but for the first time in a long time, there was a different spark in her chest. It wasn't exactly hope yet. It was too small and too fragile for that grand name, but it was something. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could change. That maybe she didn't have to live forever in that dark room, in that constant fear. That maybe someone had really heard her silent plea to the stars. Robert Aldridge was in Manchester when he received the call that would change everything. It was a rainy Tuesday, and he had just left a crucial meeting with Japanese investors interested in his new development in Canary Wharf. The phone rang, showing an unknown number. Normally he would ignore it, but something made him answer. On the other end of the line was Dr. Albert Mason, a judge from the family court in London. The conversation was direct and disturbing. The judge informed him that an investigation was underway involving his daughter Sophia, serious issues of emotional and psychological neglect. Robert felt the world spin. He tried to interrupt, to say there must be a mistake, that his wife was the president of a charity, that Sophia had everything she needed. But Dr. Albert was firm, explaining that there was concrete evidence and that Robert needed to return to London immediately for a formal meeting at the courthouse. The businessman cancelled all appointments and took the first flight back. During the 2-hour journey, his mind was a whirlwind. He tried calling Valerie several times, but she didn't answer. He called the mansion, and the maid said that the lady had gone to a charity event. Sophia was at school. Everything seemed normal, perfectly normal, as it always had been. How could anything be wrong? At London City Airport, Robert went straight to the courthouse. He arrived still in his meeting clothes, impeccable tie, shining Italian shoes, but with a face marked by worry and confusion. He was received by Helen Taylor and Dr. Marcus Foster in a discreet meeting room. On the table were organized folders, documents, a laptop prepared to play the recordings. Helen began the presentation of the facts professionally, but also with sensitivity. She knew she was about to destroy a father's reality, and that the way she conducted that conversation would determine how Robert reacted. She first showed the initial report of her visit to the mansion, the observations about Sophia's behavior, the inconsistencies in Valerie's explanations. Robert listened, still incredulous, thinking that everything could be a misunderstanding. Then Helen showed Constance's testimony. Robert vaguely remembered the maid, recalled Valerie saying she had fired her for theft. Hearing Constance's version of what had really happened, about how she had been unjustly accused for questioning Sophia's treatment, the businessman began to feel the first cracks in his certainty. The pieces began to fit together in a disturbing way. Beatrice's recordings were the hardest blow. Helen warned that the content would be difficult to hear. When the audio started, Robert immediately recognized his daughter's voice. Sophia was crying, pleading not to be locked up, saying she was hungry. And then Valerie's voice, cold, calculated, denying the child's requests with a cruelty he had never imagined possible. The man paled, his hands trembled. Cold sweat ran down his forehead, but it was the interview with Sophia that completely broke him. Dr. Julia was present and guided Robert through the main points of the conversation with the girl. She described how Sophia had spoken about the darkroom, about spending hours alone, about being afraid to call her father Daddy in front of Valerie, about feeling hungry but not being able to eat. Each revelation was a stab to Robert's heart, each detail evidence of how spectacularly he had failed as a father. Robert rested his elbows on the table and hid his face in his hands. His entire body trembled. Tears he hadn't shed in years began to fall between his fingers. How had he not noticed? How could he have been so blind? To all the trips, all the meetings, all the obsession with the business empire he had built, and for what? While he accumulated success and money, his daughter languished inside her own home, invisible, suffering, waiting for a father who was never there. Helen gave him time to process. Dr. Marcus offered water, but Robert couldn't even hold the glass without spilling. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out hoarse, broken. He asked where Sophia was at that moment, if she was well, if she was safe. Helen explained that the girl was at school, in a protected environment, and that measures were already being taken to ensure her safety. The businessman then wanted to know what would happen next. Dr. Albert Mason, who had observed everything in silence until then, explained the options. Valerie would have to immediately distance herself from Sophia. A process of intensive psychological support for the girl would begin. Robert, as the biological father and legal guardian, would have to commit to drastic changes in his life if he wanted to maintain custody of his daughter. This meant therapy, parenting courses, and regular supervision by the authorities. Robert accepted everything without hesitation. He said he would quit his businesses if necessary, that he would do whatever it took to regain Sophia's trust and correct the monumental mistakes he had made. He asked if he could see his daughter immediately. Helen suggested caution, explaining that Sophia was in a fragile emotional state and that a dramatic confrontation could frighten her even more. It would be better to prepare the ground first, with Dr. Julia's accompaniment. But Robert insisted that he needed at least to see her, even from afar, even without speaking. Helen and the judge agreed to allow him to wait at the school at dismissal time, but only observing, without approaching yet. The businessman agreed, desperate for any connection, for any way to verify with his own eyes that his daughter still existed beyond the statistics and reports he had just seen. Meanwhile, Valerie was located at a charity luncheon at the Ritz, London. 2 court officers discreetly approached her, asking her to accompany them. She tried to maintain her composure, apologizing to the other society ladies, saying there was a misunderstanding she would quickly resolve. But when she got into the official car and saw the documents presented to her, her mask began to crack. At the courthouse, Valerie was confronted with the same evidence shown to Robert. Her reaction was completely different. There were no tears of remorse or emotional revelations. Instead, she tried to argue, justify, minimize. She said Sophia was a difficult child, that she exaggerated, that she had psychological problems inherited from her mother. She tried to discredit Constance as a resentful maid, questioned the authenticity of Beatrice's recordings, suggested that the school was dramatizing normal situations. Dr. Albert listened patiently to everything, but when Valerie finished her arguments, he got straight to the point. The evidence was irrefutable. Sophia's own testimony, combined with external testimonies and recordings, painted a clear picture of systematic emotional neglect. Valerie would be immediately removed from living with the girl. A restraining order would be issued, prohibiting her from approaching Sophia or the school. The divorce process would be inevitable, and she would not be entitled to any custody or visitation. Valerie tried one last gambit, threatening to call her lawyers, talking about defamation lawsuits, about how she would destroy the reputation of everyone involved. But Dr. Albert remained impassive. He explained that she was free to hire as many lawyers as she wanted, but that Sophia's protective measures were immediate and non-negotiable. If she tried to approach the girl, it would be considered contempt of court with serious consequences. As she left the courthouse, escorted by officers who would ensure she only collected personal belongings from the mansion under supervision, Valerie realized that the castle of appearances she had built was finally in ruins. All the photos in magazines, all the gala events, all the image of a perfect philanthropist, everything would be stained when the truth came out. And it would, because cases like this did not remain secret for long in London. Robert waited at the school gate when the dismissal bell rang. He saw Sophia come out walking slowly, hugging a pink backpack that seemed too big for her thin body. Marianne was by her side, holding her hand. When Sophia looked around for the car that normally picked her up, her eyes passed over Robert. There was a moment of recognition, confusion, and then something that broke the father's heart. Fear. Sophia was afraid of him. Or rather, she was afraid of what his unexpected presence meant. The girl flinched slightly, as if expecting to be reprimanded for some transgression she hadn't committed. Robert felt the tears return. Helen, who was beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly that fear wasn't specifically about him, but about years of conditioning where surprises always meant trouble. Marianne brought Sophia to where Robert and Helen were waiting. The teacher knelt down to the girl's height and gently explained that Daddy was there to take her, that everything was fine, that there was nothing to fear. Sophia looked at her father with those large, frightened eyes, and Robert, forgetting all protocols and recommendations for caution, also knelt and opened his arms. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, Sophia stood still, undecided. Then slowly, like a wounded bird testing broken wings, she took a step towards her father, and another, until she was finally in his arms, and Robert hugged her as if he would never let her go. Feeling how small and fragile she was, how much weight she had lost, how she trembled. He whispered promises in her ear that he swore to himself he would keep, that he would never leave her again, that he would protect her, that everything would be different now. And Sophia, for the first time in years, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, those words could be true. The first few days after the revelations were the hardest. Robert took Sophia to an apartment he kept in Chelsea, far from the Belgravia mansion, and all the painful memories it held. It was a smaller, simpler space, but there was something welcoming about it that the grand house had never had. Windows that allowed sunlight to stream in freely, light-colored walls. A balcony from which the River Thames shone in the distance. Sophia walked through the apartment like a ghost, touching things with excessive care, as if everything could break or disappear at any moment. Robert observed every movement of his daughter with a heavy heart, noticing for the first time details he had always ignored. How she was too small for her age, how her eyes carried shadows too deep, how her gestures were restrained, controlled, as if taking up space was a privilege she didn't deserve. The first night was especially difficult. Robert prepared the guest room for Sophia, buying new sheets with star patterns, some stuffed animals he thought she would like. But when it was time for bed, Sophia stood at the bedroom door, trembling slightly. Robert, still learning to decipher his daughter's needs, gently asked what was wrong. Sophia looked at the room, then at her father, and in an almost inaudible voice asked if the door would be locked. The question hit Robert like a punch. He then understood that for his daughter, rooms were not safe places for rest but potential prisons. He knelt down to her height and promised that the door would never, ever be locked, that she could enter and leave whenever she wanted, that this would be her safe space. Even so, Sophia couldn't sleep alone that first night. Robert ended up setting up an inflatable mattress next to her bed and fell asleep listening to his daughter's irregular breathing as she fought nightmares. He woke up several times throughout the night, checking if Sophia was still there, if she was breathing, if she hadn't disappeared like a cruel illusion. Dr. Julia Reynolds became a constant presence in their lives. She came to the apartment 3 times a week for therapy sessions with Sophia, and also began to see Robert, helping him process the overwhelming guilt he felt and learn healthy ways to reconnect with his daughter. The psychologist explained that recovery would be slow, that years of emotional neglect did not heal in days or weeks, that Robert would need infinite patience. The sessions with Sophia revealed layers and layers of trauma. The girl spoke about the fears that consumed her. Fear of eating too much because she might be reprimanded, Fear of making noise because she might disturb. Fear of asking for things because she didn't deserve to receive. Dr. Julia worked gently to deconstruct each of these distorted beliefs, showing Sophia that she had value, that she deserved to take up space, that her needs mattered. Robert plunged headfirst into the transformation process. He delegated the company's administration to trusted partners, cancelled commitments he had previously considered non-negotiable, refused international travel. For the first time in years, his priority was not closing deals or expanding the business empire. It was regaining his daughter's trust, word by word, gesture by gesture, day by day. Meals became especially important moments. Robert discovered through Dr. Julia that Sophia had an extremely complicated relationship with food. He began to involve his daughter in the process of choosing what they would eat, took her to the supermarket, and let her choose fruits, biscuits, anything she desired. They cooked together on weekends, and Robert noticed how Sophia was still surprised when he put normal portions on her plate, how she hesitated before each bite, as if expecting permission she no longer needed to ask for. The school offered fundamental support. Marianne coordinated with the other teachers to create an even more welcoming environment for Sophia. The girl was exempted from oral presentations that could cause excessive anxiety, received extra support in subjects where she had difficulty due to the emotional stress she had experienced. Gradually, Sophia began to interact more with her classmates, still timidly, but with small progresses that filled Robert with hope. Helen Taylor continued regular monitoring, visiting the apartment fortnightly to assess progress. In her reports to Judge Dr. Albert Mason, she documented the positive changes. Robert was genuinely committed. Sophia showed gradual signs of recovery. The environment was safe and nurturing. But she also warned that the road would be long, that emotional relapses were normal, that vigilance needed to continue. Meanwhile, the legal situation unfolded. The divorce between Robert and Valerie was swift and devastating for her. With no chance to contest the evidence of neglect, Valerie lost all rights related to Sophia. She would have no custody, visitation, or any form of contact. The restraining order would remain in effect indefinitely. Valerie's lawyers tried to negotiate generous financial settlements, but Robert was inflexible. She would receive nothing beyond what was strictly necessary determined by law. Valerie's social fall was spectacular. News of the case leaked, as it always does in London, and spread through social circles like wildfire. The woman who had been celebrated as an example of philanthropy and elegance became persona non grata. She was removed from the presidency of the charity she led, had invitations to events cancelled, saw her calls ignored by people who had previously courted her. The society magazines that once photographed her now published articles about the hypocrisy of those who use charity as a facade. Constance, the former maid who had the courage to testify, was publicly recognized for her bravery. Robert personally sought her out, apologized for not believing her when she was fired, and offered her generous compensation and a letter of recommendation that restored her reputation. Constance accepted with tears of relief, saying that the most important thing was knowing that Sophia was finally safe. Beatrice and James Miller, the neighbors who provided the crucial recordings, became close friends with Robert. The retired lawyer offered legal guidance throughout the divorce process, refusing any payment and saying it was his contribution to correcting an injustice. Beatrice began to visit Sophia regularly, bringing books and telling stories, becoming a kind of grandmother figure the girl had never had. 3 months after Valerie's separation, Robert made a decision that would change everything. He sold the Belgravia mansion. He didn't want Sophia to return to that place of painful memories, nor did he himself want to relive the mistakes he had made there. The money from the sale was partially invested in an educational fund for Sophia and partially donated to legitimate child protection organizations, institutions that truly worked to prevent cases like what his daughter had suffered. Robert bought a smaller house in Notting Hill, a bohemian and welcoming neighborhood in the heart of London. It was an old building full of charm, with a garden where Sophia could play and a beautiful view of the city. The girl participated in the choice, and for the first time Robert saw genuine enthusiasm in her eyes when she pointed to the room she wanted. A spacious and bright space with large windows overlooking trees and the open sky. The move to the new house marked a new chapter. Robert and Sophia painted the walls together, chose furniture, planted flowers in the garden. The battered teddy bear from her biological mother was given a place of honor on Sophia's bedroom shelf, a symbol that the past, even the painful one, was part of her story and did not need to be forgotten, only re-signified. Sophia began piano lessons, discovering a passion for music that no one knew existed. Her small fingers danced across the keys with a lightness that contrasted with the weight she had carried for so long. Robert sat to listen to each practice, marveling at his daughter's ability to create beauty even after so much pain. Therapy continued, but now there were more smiles in the sessions. Dr. Julia noticed how Sophia was gradually allowing herself to be a child, how she played more, how she laughed more frequently, how she asked for things without fear of rejection. Nightmares still happened, but they were less frequent. Fear still existed, but it was slowly being replaced by something stronger, the certainty that she was safe, that she was loved, that she deserved all the good things life could offer. Robert also changed profoundly. The man obsessed with business and status transformed into a present and attentive father. He learned to cook dishes Sophia liked, to braid hair even if clumsily, to invent bedtime stories, to simply be there every day as he should have been from the beginning. He discovered that true success was not in the buildings bearing his name, but in his daughter's hugs, in her progress in therapy, in the small daily victories over trauma. One afternoon, Sophia made a drawing different from those she usually made. It was no longer a dark room or sad figures. It was a colorful house with a blooming garden, a man and a girl holding hands, and a huge sun shining in the sky. In the corner of the sheet, with still childish but firm letters, she wrote, "My true family." Robert framed that drawing and placed it in the living room, daily reminding himself of how far they had come and how much further they would go together. A year had passed since that day at the courthouse when Robert discovered the truth. The house in Notting Hill became a true home, filled with laughter, piano music, and the smell of pancakes that Robert had learned to make on Saturdays, Sophia's favorite recipe. The garden they planted together bloomed abundantly, sunflowers and daisies competing for space under the London sun, while a small orchard of cherry trees promised fruit for the coming seasons. Sophia had turned 8, and the transformation was remarkable. There were still emotional scars. Dr. Julia always reminded them that trauma doesn't completely disappear, it just becomes more manageable. But the girl who once shrank into the shadows now ran through the garden, climbed trees with the agility of someone finally allowing herself to be a child. Her eyes regained the sparkle that Robert only knew from old photos of her biological mother, a sparkle he had thought was lost forever. At school, Sophia was no longer the invisible girl. She made genuine friendships with classmates who invited her to birthday parties and play dates. Marianne, who remained a cherished teacher and mentor, observed with pride how Sophia now raised her hand in class, participated in group projects, and even volunteered to give a small presentation about her favorite music. Her shyness hadn't completely disappeared, but it had been tempered with gradual confidence. Robert had also transformed beyond recognition from the workaholic businessman he had been. His hair had more grey strands, a result of the stress of the previous year, but his face had a lightness it had never had before. He had learned to delegate, to trust his team, to understand that being present was worth more than any multi-million-pound contract. He remained involved in the businesses, but had established strict limits. No long trips, no meetings after 6 in the evening, or work on weekends. Sophia always came first. Family therapy, which now included joint sessions in addition to individual ones, revealed exciting progress. Dr. Julia facilitated conversations where father and daughter learned to communicate feelings, needs, fears. Sophia learned to say when she was hungry without guilt, to ask for hugs when she needed them, to express frustration in healthy ways. Robert learned to truly listen, to validate emotions without trying to fix them immediately, to be present not just physically, but emotionally. Sophia's story inspired changes beyond her family. Helen Taylor and Dr. Marcus Foster presented the case at a national conference on child protection, obviously omitting names and identifying details. The impact was profound. Authorities across the United Kingdom realized that emotional neglect in wealthy families was as harmful as neglect in poor families, but much harder to detect due to appearances of prosperity. Then came the Sunflower Project, an initiative coordinated by the family court in London that established more rigorous protocols for investigating complaints involving high-income families. Social workers received specific training to identify signs of emotional neglect hidden behind facades of perfection. Private schools were required to implement early detection programs and report not only obvious physical abuse, but also behavioral patterns indicative of psychological trauma. Robert discreetly became one of the main funders of the Sunflower Project. He sought no publicity or recognition. His support was anonymous but substantial. He wanted other children like Sophia to be identified earlier, for other blind fathers like he had been to wake up before it was too late. He believed that if his personal tragedy could prevent the suffering of other families, then perhaps there was some redemptive purpose in everything that had happened. Constance, whose courage in testifying had been fundamental in saving Sophia, became an unofficial spokesperson for the project. She gave lectures in vocational schools for domestic workers, teaching about the importance of reporting suspicious situations, how to do it safely and anonymously, and how silence can be complicity. Her story inspired other workers not to remain silent in the face of injustice, even when the fear of losing their jobs was great. Beatrice and James Miller remained close to the family. The elderly couple became Sophia's honorary grandparents, present at piano recitals, birthday parties, and Sunday dinners at the Notting Hill house. Beatrice taught Sophia to make chocolate truffles, those traditional treats at any British children's party, and the girl loved to lick the spoon covered in candy, a simple pleasure previously denied to her. James, with his experience as a lawyer, helped Robert establish a trust fund for Sophia that would guarantee her education and well-being, regardless of what happened in the future. But more important than the money was the time he spent telling the girl stories of old London, teaching her to play chess, showing her that male figures could be gentle and trustworthy. Valerie disappeared from London's social scene. Rumours said she had moved to Manchester, trying to rebuild a life where no one knew her story. The restraining order remained in effect, and she never tried to violate it, knowing that any contact with Sophia would result in severe legal consequences. In rare press interviews, she tried to minimize what she had done, presenting herself as a victim of misunderstandings, but no one believed her. The facts spoke louder than her attempts at historical revision. Sophia never asked about her ex-stepmother. It was as if that chapter of her life had been sealed, filed away in some corner of her memory where it didn't need to be constantly revisited. Dr. Julia explained that this was healthy, that Sophia didn't need to forgive or process that relationship now, that perhaps when she was older, she would choose to revisit it therapeutically, but that forcing her to confront it prematurely would be counterproductive. The piano became Sophia's refuge and expression. Her teacher, Maestro Charles, a retired musician who lived nearby in Notting Hill, was amazed by the girl's sensitivity. He said she played with an emotional depth rare in someone so young, that her interpretations carried so much feeling that sometimes he would get emotional during lessons. Sophia began to compose small melodies, simple but honest songs that Robert recorded on his phone and listened to repeatedly. The school suggested that Sophia participate in a public end-of-year recital. At first the girl hesitated, the fear of exposure still echoing from the times when being seen meant being punished. But with gentle encouragement from Robert, Marianne, and Dr. Julia, she agreed. They spent weeks rehearsing a piece called London Spring, a joyful melody that Maestro Charles had composed especially for her. The night of the recital arrived in November, when London was already beginning to feel the approaching summer heat. The school's small theatre was packed with parents, teachers, and students. Robert sat in the front row, his hands sweaty with nervousness, not for himself but for Sophia. When the girl walked onto the stage, wearing a light blue dress she had chosen herself, Robert saw something extraordinary happen. Sophia sat at the piano, adjusted her posture as Maestro Charles had taught, placed her hands on the keys. There was a moment of silence where everyone in the audience held their breath. Then she began to play. The notes flowed like clear water, sometimes skipping like sea waves, sometimes soft as an afternoon breeze. Sophia played with her eyes closed, lost in the music, in her own world where the pain of the past had been transformed into present beauty. When the last note resonated and silence returned to the theatre, there was a pause before applause erupted. Robert had tears streaming freely down his face, as did Marianne, Beatrice, Helen, who was also present, and dozens of others who understood, even if they didn't know the details, that they were witnessing something deeper than a simple school performance. They were witnessing the resurrection of a soul, the victory of light over darkness. Sophia opened her eyes, looked at the standing ovation, and for the first time in her life, allowed herself to accept that recognition without fear. She smiled, a genuine and radiant smile, and bowed. When she came down from the stage, she ran straight into Robert's arms, who lifted her and spun her around, both laughing and crying at the same time, an intertwining of joy and relief and love that transcended words. That night, back home in Notting Hill, Sophia was too energized to sleep. They sat on the balcony, drinking hot chocolate even in the warmth, looking at the city lights spread out below like earthly stars. Sophia asked Robert if he was proud of her. He held his daughter's face in his hands and said he was more than proud, that she was the bravest person he knew, that her ability to recover and flourish after everything she had been through was nothing short of miraculous. Sophia was quiet for a moment, then said something Robert would never forget. She said she was happy, that for the first time she could remember what that word meant, that she felt as if she had lived in the dark for a long time, but now finally saw the sun, and that if she ever found another child who felt as she had felt, she would help because she knew it was possible to get out of that dark, that there was always hope even when it seemed there wasn't. Robert hugged his daughter, feeling the weight of those words. He realized that Sophia had not only survived, but had transformed her suffering into empathy, her pain into purpose. At 8 years old, she already understood something many adults never learn, that the deepest wounds can become sources of our greatest strength, that the ability to heal can inspire others to heal too, that light after the rain shines brighter because it has known the storm. 2 full years had passed since that transformative day at the courthouse. Sophia was now 10, and the girl she had been was a distant memory, almost like another person in another life. The Notting Hill house breathed life into every corner. Plants Sophia watered religiously every morning. Paintings she had done in art classes proudly hung on the walls. The constant sound of the piano she now mastered with impressive skill for her age. Robert celebrated his 45th birthday at an intimate garden party. Unlike the grand events he used to organize back at the mansion, this was a small but significant gathering. Helen and Dr. Marcus, who had become close family friends, Beatrice and James with their affectionate grandparental smiles, Marianne, who remained a beloved mentor even after Sophia moved up a year, Constance with her family, Maestro Charles, and some of Sophia's school friends who laughed loudly running among the sunflowers. The biggest surprise of the night came when Sophia, with Beatrice's secret help, revealed her gift, a complete musical composition called Light After the Rain. The girl asked for silence, sat at the piano Robert had installed in the garden especially for the party, and began to play. The melody began somber, low notes evoking storms and sadness, then gradually transformed, ascending scales, becoming lighter, brighter, until finally exploding into a joyful movement that made anyone want to dance. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Robert hugged his daughter for long minutes, whispering that it was the most beautiful masterpiece he had ever heard. Not just for the music itself, but for what it represented, their complete journey. From darkness to light, from separation to union, from hopelessness to a bright future. Sophia whispered back that she had composed it thinking not only of their story, but of all the children who still lived in the dark, waiting for someone to see them. That conversation planted a seed in Robert. In the following days, he approached Helen with a proposal. He wanted to expand the Sunflower Project, transforming it into a full foundation dedicated to identifying and supporting children living in situations of emotional neglect, especially in contexts where the appearance of prosperity masked suffering. Helen was enthusiastic, and together they began to work on the structure. The Light After the Rain Foundation was officially launched 6 months later at a ceremony in central London. Robert was clear in his mission. He didn't just want to identify cases of neglect, but to create a complete support network. The foundation would offer free therapy for children and families, training for education and health professionals, awareness campaigns, and a direct hotline where anyone, including domestic workers, could report suspicious situations anonymously without fear of retaliation. Sophia participated in the launch, not as an exposed victim, but as silent inspiration. No details of her personal story were publicly revealed, only that the foundation was born from the real experience of a family that had learned the hard way the importance of truly being present. The girl played Light After the Rain for those present, and her music became the symbol of the foundation, representing the possibility of transformation and healing. Constance was hired as coordinator of the Domestic Worker Support Program. Her mission was to create a safe network where employees could report problematic situations without fear of losing their jobs or facing false accusations. They established partnerships with unions and labor organizations, creating legal protections for whistleblowers and emergency funds for those unjustly dismissed after making legitimate complaints. Helen became the foundation's executive director, bringing all her decades of experience in child protection. Under her leadership, they developed a revolutionary protocol for identifying emotional neglect that began to be adopted by family courts across the United Kingdom. The protocol included behavioral, environmental, and relational indicators that helped professionals see beyond appearances of wealth and status. Dr. Marcus coordinated the training program, traveling the country, offering workshops for social workers, psychologists, and educators. His seminars were always packed, demonstrating the growing awareness of a problem that was previously invisible. He always emphasized that emotional neglect was as harmful as any physical abuse, leaving invisible but deep scars that could affect entire lives if not treated. The foundation also established partnerships with private schools, which had previously been resistant to admitting that neglect problems could exist among their wealthy families. Robert, using his influence as a respected businessman, convinced principals that protecting children was more important than protecting institutional reputations. They implemented discreet observation programs, where teachers were trained to identify warning signs without stigmatizing students. Marianne became an educational consultant for the foundation, developing educational materials on child emotional well-being. She created a program called Small Voices, Big Stories, where children were encouraged to express their feelings through art, music, or writing, creating safe communication channels where attentive adults could detect subtle calls for help that would otherwise go unnoticed. The foundation's impact began to spread rapidly. In the first year, they identified and supported 120 families in problematic situations in London alone. The stories varied, children being neglected by work-addicted parents, others being emotionally abused by step-parents, some simply invisible in houses too large where no one truly saw them. Each case received individualized attention, appropriate therapy, and long-term follow-up. Sophia, meanwhile, flourished in ways that continued to surprise everyone. At 10 years old, in addition to her extraordinary musical abilities, she developed a passion for writing. She began to keep a diary, where she recorded not only her days but also imaginary letters to children who might be going through what she had gone through. She wrote about hope, about how darkness is temporary, about how there is always someone willing to help if you have the courage to let yourself be seen. With encouragement from Dr. Julia, who remained her therapist but now saw Sophia only once a month for maintenance, the girl decided to turn these letters into a project. Under a pseudonym to protect her identity, she published a small book called Letters to You in the Dark. The book was distributed free of charge by the foundation in schools, shelters, and pediatric offices, reaching thousands of children who found in Sophia's words the comfort of not being alone. Robert watched everything with a mixture of pride and humility. His daughter had not only survived, but had transformed her pain into purpose, her experience into a tool to help others. He himself wrote an article for a business magazine, not about his lucrative ventures, but about the real cost of success when built on absence and family neglect. The article went viral, generating important discussions in business circles about work-life balance. Robert's company did not suffer from his reduced, obsessive dedication. On the contrary, it prospered under the collaborative leadership he had implemented. He discovered that delegating and trusting his team resulted in more creativity and productivity than micromanaging everything. His priorities had completely changed. But paradoxically, or perhaps predictably, this had made him not a worse businessman, but a better, more human, and visionary leader. On the 3rd anniversary of the day everything changed, Robert and Sophia performed a private ritual. They returned to Belgravia, not to the mansion that no longer belonged to them, but to the beach. They walked along the sand at sunset, the same sun Sophia used to observe through the narrow window of her room, wishing for freedom. Now she ran freely, the sea breeze messing up her hair, her laughter echoing over the waves. Robert stopped to watch her, engraving that moment in his memory as tangible proof that redemption was possible, that mistakes could be corrected, that true love had healing power. Sophia called her father to build a sandcastle together. As they worked, she talked about her future plans. She wanted to study psychology when she grew up, specializing in child trauma. She wanted to help other children the way Dr. Julia had helped her. Robert felt tears in his eyes, not of sadness but of deep gratitude for having a second chance, for his daughter choosing to transform suffering into service. The sandcastle they built was elaborate, with towers and bridges, open windows that allowed light to enter, so different from the dark room where Sophia had lived. When they finished, they sat to admire it, knowing that the tide would eventually carry it away, but that at that moment it represented something permanent in their lives, the complete reconstruction of what had been broken, the creation of something new and beautiful on the rubble of the past. They returned home when the stars began to appear in the sky. Sophia pointed to a particularly bright one and said she liked to think it was her biological mother watching, happy to see how things had improved. Robert agreed, adding that perhaps all the people who helped them were also stars, guides who illuminated the path when everything seemed too dark to find a way out. In the Notting Hill house, Sophia played the piano before bed as she did every night. Light After the Rain sounded even more beautiful, matured with practice. Robert listened from the balcony, watching the lights of London shine in the distance, thinking of all the houses where children might be suffering in silence, waiting for someone to see them. He promised himself that the foundation would continue to grow, reaching more families, saving more children, until no girl or boy had to live what Sophia had lived. When the last chord resonated and Sophia appeared on the balcony for her goodnight hug, Robert held her and whispered the words he now repeated every night, the same ones he had promised that day at the school gate years ago. "I'm here. I'll always be here." And Sophia, with the tranquil smile of someone who finally believed those words, replied, "I know, Daddy, I know." End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Sophia and Robert's story has touched your hearts deeply. This narrative reminds us that even in the most luxurious mansions, children can be suffering in silence, invisible behind facades of perfection. But it also shows us that transformation is possible, that true love has healing power, and that from our deepest pain can be born a purpose that illuminates not only our lives, but those of countless other people. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to embark on more emotional journeys with us. We have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the complexity of life, the power of redemption, and the strength of the human spirit. You can find it by clicking here. Your participation is fundamental for us to continue sharing these narratives that touch souls and transform perspectives. If Sophia and Robert's story moved you, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the stories we bring daily. Like the video. This helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of hope and transformation. And don't forget to comment, what part of the story touched you the most? Do you know anyone who could benefit from this message? Share your reflections with us. Every comment, every share, every subscription motivates us to continue creating content that matters, that makes a difference, that reminds us all of our shared humanity. Remember, just as Sophia found her light after the rain, each of us has the power to transform our darkness into clarity, our pain into purpose, and together we can create a world where no child has to live in the shadows, where all suffering is seen, where every voice is heard. See you in the comments and in the next story. See you soon, and may your life always be illuminated by hope and true love.